hello everyone, thank you for being here. It's lovely to see some familiar faces and to see faces for the first time as well virtually. My name's Matt Tobin and I work at Oxford Brookes. I teach teachers and also I've got a real fascination in children's literature. Great pleasure of knowing Chitra, and I actually invited Chitra to come and talk to the students a couple of years ago pre-lockdown, and it went down fantastic. Just to say, before I introduce Chitra and her work, I've got some questions already, but if you think of any in the chat, I'll try and get to them. But we both got sent some questions prior to the event, and they're so good they could end up taking up most of the event if we wanted them to. But if you have anything you think of, do add them in. So let me welcome Chitra to this event. I think you probably know that she's an internationally published author with 50 books for children under her belt, but it's also, that's a lot. It's also an oral storyteller and writer of lots of different things, including some absolutely stunningly beautiful pitch books and fiction for younger readers, which we'll explore today. And her stories are inspired by folktales from India and Hindu mythology and her journeys around the world. And I'm very excited to be able to ask Chitra all the questions that I would like to ask her this evening about her work and her wonderful stories. So I thought a nice thing to ask Chitra to do to start us off is just describe what a shard of moon and, a sliver of moon and a shard of truth is about to the viewers.
Okay, thank you, Matt. Thanks for doing this, and thanks everybody for coming. A Sliver of Moon and a Shard of Truth is basically the third book in the series of Prince Veera and Suku. So the first book is A Dollop of Ghee and a Pot of Wisdom, and the second is A Jar of Pickles and a Pinch of Justice. Ooh. And so that's the first one, and then that's the third one. And all of these three books are basically reimagined folk tales from India. So we grew up in India listening to trickster tales, and these trickster tales were set in medieval India in the courts of Emperor Akbar and the South Indian kings like Krishna Devaraya. And these tales kind of merged together. So some people will say the same story as it came from the north, and some people will have the same reference to a South Indian story. And all of this came together. Woohoo, Mara is here. She will know more of the background. She's the editor of this series. And when I wanted to tell these stories, but I wanted them to be more contemporary while keeping the historical element to it. So I didn't want it to be two old men like the king and the minister talking to each other, because that will put it slightly far away from the kids who are reading it. So I wanted to make the two characters who are the tricksters into two young people, but still within the monarchy setting, within the old-fashioned settings and the background of the stories. So a lot of Indian parents recognize the spine of the stories, but the setting and the characters are different. But given I created these two characters, and I then was able to then play with them and give them more character and personalities and families and all of that kind of stuff. So they're all reimagined trickster tales from India.
Lovely. And that was interesting about the north and the south there of India. We might have to explore that a little bit more in a later question. And it's interesting because as I read through them, I really like my traditional tales too. There are elements I was picking up on thinking, this is an essence of something I've read before, but I want to kind of move into that actually, which is it's clear that traditional tales, whether it's myths or fairy tales or legends or whatever form, they folk tales, I think it's strong on the folk here actually. They really appeal to you, and because I know you explore them in other stories, thankfully too. I think you've got a wonderful gift for writing this kind of genre. But what is it for you, especially Chitra, that is appealing about traditional tales?
I think the first thing is it's personal, because I grew up with these stories. I was told these stories. So my grandmother, my dad's mom, and her sister, they used to do a lot of storytelling during the summer. So we used to do mango pickles at home. We used to pluck them from the trees, put them in salt, and while we are being put to work, child labor, we were then told stories that will keep us occupied, so we won't be complaining about the work that we're doing in the sun or on the terrace sitting and doing things. So if you've gone to an Indian restaurant, you will eat papad. So we used to make them at home, but to do them you have to dry them out in the terrace, on the terrace in the sun, and we have to make sure that the crows don't eat. So we'll be sitting in the shade chasing the crows away, and our grandmothers will be actually making them so they can be put to dry, and they will be talking as they were making. So that's my big introduction into these folk tales. And then we have a comic book company called Amar Chitrakatha in India. Amar Chitrakatha, actually that just means, Amar means timeless, Chitra means picture, which is my name, visuals, and Katha means stories. So they were basically timeless tales with pictures. And these were comic books that pretty much told us history, legends, trickster tales, all of them in comic book form. And I read them by tons and tons. We used to go to a library which was 10 miles away, two buses to take. And every 2 weeks, my mom used to take me, and I'll bring back 5 bags full of books, and sit down and read them, and then we'll take them back again. So that's why I like retelling them, especially trickster tales, because they're like clever. They have that twist which you weren't expecting, and it's like a puzzle for kids. You kind of try and figure out. And when I tell these stories in schools, the children actually debate the answers. They go, oh no, I think this will happen. Oh no, that will happen. No, that should happen. And they will have that debate, and then I'll tell them what the answer was and how the story ended. They'll go, yeah, that sounds right, and that was clever. So for me, that's the appeal of trickster tales. And you kind of found the essence, because some of these tales have traveled, especially the stories, like in the first book, the story of the laddus, is told in many African countries as the story of the lamb curry. The same story, the neighbors fighting over the sweets, and who smell, who owns the goat, and that kind of thing happens there as well. So I think some of these stories have obviously traveled.
Yeah, and thankfully, and I love how each culture, I guess, adapts that story to whatever is important to that culture. Think about that with the Cinderella variants. I think in Wales, the helper in Cinderella is a sheep, and I just have to kind of go, oh, that explains so much about our history. So that was absolutely, I had no idea about that in your name. That's beautiful. And I love the idea of you traveling very far to go to the library to kind of collect all these stories. But the fact that it was told as a way of engaging and keeping you helping is just what a lovely kind of image, even if it was child labor.
I do that now with my nephews. I tell them stories
You
while they
passed it on.
stack the dishwasher.
So you've talked a bit about the comics that inspired you, but I wondered if you could tell us a little bit more about some of the other sources. So you've spoken about your grandmother, but when you were planning these trickster tales, were there other books or word of mouth, people that came across, that you encountered that gave you some of these stories that you could share with us? Because I think sometimes trying to find the sources of our stories can be a great inspiration for children, but it's also basically really fascinating as well.
For these, most of these, I knew the stories already, which is why I wanted to put them in. But what I will do is, because a lot of it is orally told, I have a few books that I brought from India which are in Tamil, and they don't embellish. They just tell you, like, it's just half a page of what happened in that story. And so some of these were printed in the 1960s or 50s, which I've been holding on to for ages. And 90%, I think probably 95% of all of the stories were told to me. I don't think I researched most of them. I just remember all of these because these were so clever, and I learned a lot of things about life from these stories. So I do a storytelling event for adults, which is I tell them 5 stories that my grandmother told me with the moral of the story of how the life lesson it gave me. So that's kind of why I picked these stories. But what I did was obviously they have to fit the characters I have created. And because each story is about 2,000 words, if you actually read the story, there'll be 2 or 3 puzzles in each. So they're basically put together. So I learned them as 3 stories, but they're joined into a single narrative so that one connects to the other. In one case, for example, the story in the first book, which is the crows, the counting of the crows, is actually then related to this entire book, because this entire book came about because of the character I introduced for that story, which is the king, Apurva, Raja Apurva, that we brought back for this book. So basically, I took the stories I knew, I verified to make sure that story is still there and it's existing in my head correctly, like little details if I wanted to check, and then I'll connect them. But I've discarded a few that I couldn't use, like if there were stories either weren't suitable for 2 boys to talk about, or they were having things that weren't contemporary in their essence, because these are medieval stories. So sometimes you don't want to bring topics that you don't want to perpetrate now. But most of them were stories that had to be adapted to the 2 characters. So that's kind of what I did.
Which was annoyingly, you make seem effortless, because yeah, that's such a gift in what you're doing. Thank you. And I think we touched on something that Savita and Barbara are asking, which was this idea of inspiration and where these stories were coming from. We might have time to kind of talk a little bit more about that, but that was so clear. Thank you so much. The thing I thought about as you were speaking was this idea that there's an interest in the stories you're telling around the kind of the moral kind of element, this idea of there's a lesson to be learned. And it reminds me a little bit of fables too, and whether I know this isn't about animals, but not all fables are, but whether there's a kind of folkloric kind of element, that idea of people telling people stories about the rights and the wrongs. But I think we've got time to come into that in a moment. There's one question, and I didn't quite know how to phrase this, and you've already mentioned it a little bit, which was these are stories that are coming from perhaps northern and southern India, and you've brought them to the UK. And I just felt that, I know you talked about not having some parts of the stories in because they weren't suitable for the boys to puzzle out, but were there other kind of cultural elements that you felt you had to, the phrase king, for instance, or whatever, that you had to adapt for Walker and for a kind of UK-based audience at all?
I think when we wrote it, and when Mara first commissioned the first book itself, we knew we were writing to an audience that will not know these stories. And even if they're Indian kids, I'm not sure all the parents are telling all of the stories that they grew up with all the time. So one of the things that happens to me when I go to the Emirates Festival or when I talk to Indian parents is, for them, this is an easy way to pass on their own legacy of knowing these stories as well. So the first thing I wanted, that's one of the reasons we created The Boys, was to make it easy for young readers to pick it up and identify with the characters themselves. And the second thing, probably the adaptation would have been more in the language itself. So wanted to make sure the explanation of terminology is in context, and we didn't want to include a glossary. We didn't want it to make like a end of the book, here are the things you should know kind of thing. We wanted to make sure that everything was included. But one of the things that we didn't want, for example, a lot of these trickster tales, when the main character avoids a problem, was because he was bullied by the other courtiers in Akbar's court. So that's one of the reasons we didn't want those elements to be the ministers, and they wanting to bully the most favorite minister of all, because in King Akbar's court, he was an emperor, and Birbal, Raja Birbal, so Emperor Akbar was a Muslim king, and Raja Birbal was a Hindu minister, and they were best friends. And even today, when you go to Delhi, you will see that Raja Birbal's house is the only house inside the king's palace. Everybody else weren't living with the king. So he was the king's favorite, and everybody was bullying him. So those elements of why the problem happened, or why this particular tricky question would have come up, I removed those elements because the characters were not exactly the same characters. They were now boys who were solving somebody else's problem. So I kind of distanced the boys from that. But in the third book, we did have some situations where we introduced some family issues as well. And one of the reason why Rajapur was introduced in the main story was the counting of the crows was one of those bullying stories in the original folklore. Is the other ministers wanted to get Raja Birbal into trouble, so they asked him to go and count the crows, and they thought he'll definitely get into trouble. So that gave me an opportunity to explore two things. One, because we set up that King Bhima, the father of Prince Veera, was a good king, we couldn't make him the bullying person. But we can introduce an older person from a previous generation. We all know, we all have grandparents who don't necessarily have the same liberal ideology as us. And so wanted to introduce him to be the one seeing the class differences between Veera and Sukhu. Because King Bhima was much more liberal, whereas the grand uncle was necessarily not comfortable with the prince being best friends with a farmer's son. So I wanted to bring that definitely, because that's still a huge problem in India, and that's something I used to fight about all the time when I was growing up. So I wanted to show that difference, and it was convenient to have a king who was not as liberal as the parents. And then we wanted to turn that around in the third book so that we could make him understand how things work. So that's how the third book happened.
That's great. I mean, I think you may have answered a question that I asked later on, but in it's a really great, in a super way. I was really interested in, you know, why the boys moved for this third book, but I think you answered that beautifully.
But can I add something to that? The
Of course.
third book idea didn't come from me. The third book idea came from my nephew. He's now 9, yesterday. So he's a big fan of the books. So after I did both the books, he came to me and said, "Where's the third book?" I said, "Oh, I have to ask Mara. I am not writing a third book." And he said, "Okay, if you can go and ask your editor, can you please set this in Raja Apurva's kingdom, because he was quite rude in the first book, so maybe he needs to be taught a lesson." And I thought, oh my God, that's a fantastic idea. And I could immediately see the stories that will work. And I was like, oh my God, I'm going to go and ask Mara. I asked her, she said, send me a synopsis. And I put together these stories that happened there. And I was able to pick out the stories that originally in the folklore happened every time Emperor Akbar was a bit short-tempered. The rude things he did, I was able to attribute it to Raja Apurva and set the whole thing there. So the thing like the son-in-law story where he wants to imprison all the son-in-laws in the kingdom was something that Emperor Akbar, it's attributed to Emperor Akbar himself. So I thought, okay, I'll take all the negative stories where he needs to be taught a lesson and then put it in this book. And that kind of then created a narrative for the third book.
What's utterly beautiful about that from your nephew is your nephew's got the essence of what all traditional tales are, which is about lessons, you know, whether it's right or wrong or justice or injustice. He tapped into that and just said, this guy's got to learn something actually about his behavior. It's just remarkable that he's done that, and maybe kind of emphasizes, no, not maybe, it emphasizes why traditional tales are so important. I know, Chitra, you were saying earlier about these are stories that I grew up with, and you question whether, you know, in India, these stories are being passed down. But I would question the same here in the UK with whatever cultures and stories are being passed down, whether, you know, it used to be a given that you were just told fairy tales, whether they're problematic or not. Well, they are, some of them, but, you know, the fact that we've got these new stories that you're providing us with as ways for children to look at these big questions about right and wrong is wonderful. And that gets back to, someone's asked a different question later on about your your titles, and I don't want to answer it yet because I want to find time to answer it. But as I picked these up before speaking to you, I can see that in order you go wisdom, justice, and truth. And I think those are things that are really, children are very interested in those things. They might not have the words for those, those kind of concepts, but I think they're interested in that because they're surrounded in a world where lots of older people are telling them what's right and wrong. So they build up that whole thing.
It happens in every school visit. They are very keen to get justice. They want the person to be punished. You can have, like, they actually have very strong opinions. And then there will be, the clown in the class who will always put up his hand for the villain. So I'll ask them who thinks this should be the answer and who thinks this should be the answer. There'll always be 3 kids who will say, no, I think they should let him go and he didn't do anything wrong. And then the other group will start arguing and they actually have a proper debate about what's right and wrong, and then I'll reveal the answer. So yes, they are very interested, especially I normally do this with year 4 to 6 because it's a little too hard to understand trickster tales for the younger children. But everybody else, I think once you're older enough to understand the ethical questions, then it's a very interesting way to open up these conversations.
Yes, it's great. I think it's fantastic. Now, I want to talk a little bit about you now as a writer. And on your website, you've got this beautiful tagline that says dreamer, writer, storyteller. And we're going to take you into the classroom a little bit here, or working with children. And I want to find out more about what you mean by dreamer. Writer's pretty obvious, and storyteller, but I want to get under the hood of those kind of themes. So can you tell us a little bit more about why you think it's important to dream and imagine for you as a writer, and what being a dreamer means to you?
Ooh, a big one. So I think basically most writers, I'm sure a lot of people on this call must have got this. I have still my progress reports from year 2 and year 3, which all says talks too much, never listens, probably distracted. I was very hardworking. I absolutely loved school. I liked homework, but I didn't I wasn't necessarily the person who will do it on rote. Even now, like when I do stage performances, I don't do any stage performance where I have to remember lines by heart, because I'm more of a person who wants to embellish at the minute when I'm doing things. So I don't prepare as much. I just need to know the stuff and then talk about it. So for me, a lot of it is making up. Now, luckily, my parents are not on this call, so I can tell you as a teenager, dreamer got me through pretty much all my life, because we grew up very, very conservative Orthodox, and I studied in a mixed school. So I had boys and girls in the school until I went to university, and talking to boys was not necessarily the right thing to do when we were growing up. So I will invent every possible excuse to spend time with my friends. And my parents did not know even till today. But obviously they've met my friends. But now what I do is when I go into schools, my first thing I will start introducing myself in the assembly is like, I'm a postwoman who lives in a post box. And then that'll create a conversation with the entire school about whether postwoman can live in a post box. And we'll create this whole world about it. Or I'll say, when I was slightly late today because when I was on the train, a dragon attacked my train and the whole train blew up and I had to make the train on my own. And then there'll be, especially the key stage 1 children will be like actually having a conversation with me about whether this is real or not. And that gives them an opportunity to do the same when I then go into the classroom to ask them to imagine a story, because you need to kind of show them how to do it. And one of the things, I'm going to credit Andy Stanton for this. He taught me this method. Basically, I have a book which is just filled with first lines for stories. Literally, I'll just write a random first line. So I'll sit down and write 10 first lines every day for a month. And these are just to create an opportunity to write these stories, create this germ of stories that might or might not become stories. But I think I was probably in year 3 when my teacher came. Our school had oral storytelling competition, and I'm full of oral stories at home. So even without checking with anybody at home, I put up my hand, and I didn't tell anybody at home that I was competing. All I did was I went home and asked my aunt, and we live in a joint family. So my aunt, my uncles, everybody, we live together. And I went to my aunt and I said, "Oh, you need to tell me a story." And she said, "Oh, you're not doing homework?" I said, "No, this is homework. Just tell me a story." And she told me one of the stories that my grandmother used to tell me. And the next day, I just went up on stage and extempore, literally told the story in English. I learned the story in Tamil. I went and told the story in English. I still have the book. It's my first ever book as a prize I got. Got the first prize in storytelling when I was in year 3, which is a Enid Blyton book, hardback, which is literally the first book I owned. And I tell this story every time I go into schools to say, make up a story. And one of the things I do in schools as well is tell them, if I tell you a story, you have my permission to go and retell that story to anybody else. So go ahead and retell that story to one more person, even if it's your fish at home. So that's kind of how most of the time I'm working. In my head, I'm just creating stuff.
That's lovely. And Andy Stanton's idea is absolutely brilliant. I would be absolutely executing that in the classroom. But that whole story of you taking a story from your mother and then turning it into English and then reciting it because you owned that story, really. It was yours. And I love this idea that you're saying about embellishing the story and not learning it by rote, which is, there are some storytelling schools, and I think sometimes there's a mix-up on retelling stories that children are told in some places that they've got to learn it by rote, but actually that's not owning a story at all. You know, I can remember Philip Pullman talking about stories too, and he said what you said, which is, you know, learn it, but then make it your own, and they're your words that, you know, you've got the structure. So that's what a beautiful kind of, that's a lovely image. I'll want to see a picture of the book later on, that you won the Enid Blyton, or maybe, yeah, no, it would be lovely to see. It's a lovely story. So that leads then into beautifully into the storytelling element, Chitra, which is, you know, you write stories, and I feel that when you're writing these stories, they are there to be read aloud. There's something in the language that you use that means they're to be read aloud. But for you, when you're up on a stage telling a story or reading a story, there's obviously going to be a lot of differences. Can you tell me about the freedom that comes with telling a story rather than reading from one, and why you think it's valuable?
When I'm writing, I'm pretty much reading it every time I change it. So if I change a story 50 times, then I'm reading it aloud 50 times. So I cannot read aloud. For me, but the writing of the story is very different to the telling of the story. But imagining the telling helps me in the writing. So I'm already imagining, oh, if I put a repetitive phrase here, I know how I will use it on stage. So when I did the Bloomsbury book, Tiger Trouble, the Troubles, for me, I knew exactly how I wanted the chant to go, and how I wanted the repetitive structure and the circular structure to go in the telling. So even though the story started on paper, it got refined because I was an oral storyteller. So I was like, oh, I know how to do. And that story I performed today on stage at Barnes Literature Festival. And it was like the whole group, 300 children chanting with me, is so joyful. So that goes back to, so when I'm writing, I'm always thinking, oh, how will I use this in a classroom, in an assembly session? What activities can children use this to engage? Because I was 6 when I got my first blackboard. So I was a teacher even before anybody thought I was going to be a teacher. And then my first job was teaching. I taught computer science for 7 years before I went into full-time programming and corporate jobs and all of that kind of stuff. So I'm still a teacher at heart. So I'm always thinking, how do I use this with children? how do I play with the story. So when I tell the story, I never read the story. I can't. Yeah, I find it really restricting to read the story because I know the story. I make it up, but also the audience energy feeds me in. So I will stop many times to get prompts from them. So I'll say, "Oh, who did this?" And then they'll all shout out, and then we'll continue, and then we'll keep doing that. I remember I was in, I think, in Essex at the one of the festivals, and was doing this back and forth, and this one 4-year-old got up and put up his hand and said, "What? Can you please stop asking questions and tell the story?" So it was like so much fun interacting with them, and only where there are chants, only where there are specific words I want to use, I'll use the exact words from the book. But also, because I've told them on stage so many times, I also know the actions that go with it. And for many of the books, whether it's Spartan's Pumpkin or You're Safe with Me or You're Snug with Me, I have nursery rhymes that go with it, which we sing together. Year sixes sing nursery rhymes with me when I do the book. They're so happy to sing it. So I take the nursery rhyme tune, the rhyme tune, and then I change the words, and the words will be on the screen, and then we'll all sing together. So I'll give them one round to get used to the words, and then we'll all sing together. Obviously, we can't sing for another month in public, but until after that, and I'll be ready to start singing again with them. But I can only do nursery rhymes. I can't do any other tune. I can't keep any other tune.
There's lots to take away from that. The nursery rhyme thing makes so much sense now, and those picture books are so beautiful, Chitra. And I think this idea that you mentioned, an energy that you get from the audience when you're telling a story, and that communal element is really important. I'd love to think teachers start to be brave and learn and tell stories as well. And I think it's great that you're saying you don't need to know it verbatim. You just own it and know the bare bones and make it your own. I'm looking through A, the time, and B, the list of questions that I've got going. Obviously, I've prepared far too many questions, but we'll move into A Sliver of Moon and a Shard of Truth. Now, I've written down, ask Chitra to read the first 2 paragraphs, but I won't ask you to read the first 2 paragraphs. It's absolutely fine as a way of going in. But the first thing I want to say is, when you asked me to talk about this, and I knew we were going to spend more time with the 2 boys again, it's Prince Vera and Suku, I was so over the moon, because these boys are fantastic. And I think something that interests me about them is, A, their problem solving. Yes, it's trickster's tales, but if we think about traditional tales and all the different areas, myths and legends and fairy tales, they're all about solving a problem and overcoming problems, and maybe going to someone wise for advice. But often also there's fighting and there's violence, and yours comes from the mind and the brain and having the wit to overcome an obstacle. And I can see the origins of the stories now, but I'd like to know more about what was the draw for you. You've talked about it a little bit, but I'd love you to expand on what was the draw for you, that the boys would only use their wit to solve all these problems within the court.
I think the stories appealed to me as a kid because they were clever. So they were, because I was a geek, I was a nerd. I didn't play sports at all in school. So even though I read adventure stories, and I probably never read superhero comics at all. So my interest was more in the cleverness of it. Like, that's how I read my poetry as well, when the words are so beautifully turned. For me, wordplay and these kind of witty turning points, that's one of my favorite things in stories. So that was always the draw, and that's why I probably remembered all of these stories. And when I wrote these books, we were very clear that these books were not going to be, they're not combative, even though sometimes they do face somebody who has been exploited, or they have to solve a problem for someone who is in desperate need. It was not about going and fighting with their swords or or being even Prince Veera being Prince Veera and taking to fight. So it was more about cleverly solving the problem. And I think we do need to teach children negotiation skills. We do need to teach them how to find compromises, because we I find often telling these stories leads, especially with my nephews, but also in classrooms, they actually have this epiphany. They go, oh, you know what? And then they actually tell me an incident that happened in the classroom where they could have solved it using one of these stories. And then you go, okay, my job here is done. I can
Yes,
go
it is.
now.
Yeah.
So I think that's what these are for me. I'm not a good aggressor. I'm I can talk, but the minute you stand up and behave like a bully, I'll just run the other way. So for me, the element of being able to trick you into my way of thinking was more appealing. So that's kind of how these stories are structured as well.
Thank you. That was wonderful. And I think that element you mentioned two things: wordplay and cleverness. And I think once children kind of see that they're powerful things to get hold of when dealing with life around them, I think it can become a wonderful thing. And to kind of build on that, not to build on that, sorry, I'll regress, because Darren asked a really good question, which is your favourite trickster story? Do you have a favourite trickster story?
I think it's in the first book. It's the gray elephants story. My grandmother and I used to repeat that story over and over again. The story of a potter being very abusive to his neighbor, who is a washerwoman, and the boys help the washerwoman, and in the story she's made into Suku's auntie, so there is a reason for why they're stepping in to solve the problem. And one of my favorite stories, and even for telling, because I actually measure the elephant in on the stage, and it's so funny doing the elephant's tail and stepping away so that the elephant doesn't pee on you. So those kind of things are so funny to do. So for me, that story stood out. Like, I definitely wanted, but most of these stories are stories that I really remembered. Like, they were stuck with me. So I probably think the gray elephants is my favorite. And if I'm right, and you can ask Mara later, I think it's Mara's favorite story as well.
Some Bex Sinara has also said it's one of her favourites. Well, her 8-year-old's favourites too. So that's lovely. Oh, Beck, hello, waving. I can see you. So can we come back to the boys as well? Because I think you've alluded to their creation a little bit, but it's such a good device. You've got Prince Veera, who's obviously surrounded by wealth in the court, and then you've got his friend Suku, who is a farmer's boy, not a lot of money, which obviously is brought up a bit in the Sliver of Moon. Actually, I thought that was interesting. It just works so well. But can I ask where the origin of that pairing came from and why you think it's so successful?
I think multiple reasons. One reason is because I definitely wanted to showcase and show people that there are inequalities in life everywhere, and we are all not the same. Even if we think we are the same, people don't perceive us the same way. Class, race, caste in India, so all of that adds a big thing. So I wanted to show that they can be equal, and they actually spar with each other. They constantly tease each other, and it's fine. There are no consequences to that. The second aspect of that was I wanted Veera to get a common man's perspective. Now, a king has the experience to know what his people are going through because he's been ruling over them for many years, and if he's a good king, then he probably knows the problems of his people. But as a boy, if Prince Veera needs to understand the perspective of a common man, I thought he needed somebody who has gone through that experience to tell him how it is. And therefore, it's like in the washerwoman story, Veera will ask the washerwoman to show how she washes clothes, and Suku will be like, what do you mean how to wash clothes? You just wash clothes. And Veera will be like, I'm a prince, I've never washed clothes, so please explain to me how you wash clothes. So, and that is also a device to show how the trick is going to work, but it's also a device to show that the prince is in a position of privilege, and he needs to constantly be reminded that not everybody is like him.
A lot of things that you're juggling, as a reader, you don't see the magic behind the plot of the word. So that's absolutely fascinating, and I love this idea that actually there's lots of cultural connotations in the common man and the aristocrat and the prince. And I'm thinking about some of the European fairy tales I've read, where the common person is often referred to as the simpleton, and the king sets them a challenge, and somehow the simpleton always manages it, with usually with the help of some friends. But this is different with these two boys, and they're such wonderful characters. Um, and I've realised that I've got about 3 minutes of me asking my final questions and be greedy. But I think it's really important we talk about Uma Krishna Swami's illustrations, and I'm thinking about the very early traditional tales that would have been printed. The first ones would have been woodcuts of some sort, and Uma's illustrations have a kind of woodcut feel to them. And I wondered how you felt when you first saw them, and what your thoughts are of them, because they bring the story, they're not needed, but they embellish beautifully, and they bring the story to life. And in some ways, maybe they provide a bridge for a reader not from that culture and from that culture too. So I'll stop
Yeah,
talking, Chitra, and let you talk.
Uma is from Chennai as well, where I live, and we both knew each other. So when Mara asked me, "Do you know anybody who can do these illustrations?" I recommended Uma, and luckily everything worked out. But Uma is a professor of illustration in folk art. So her PhD and she teaches folk art. She goes around the country learning folk art from different parts of India, because India is so big and each region has its own folk art specifically. And she's very keen. Like last year, not last year, the year before, when I was in India, she had just come back from spending a month and a half in the north of India, in Varanasi, where she was learning from a local artisan expert on how to draw a few things. So she just sits with them and workshops with them and things like that. So she's amazing. And what we wanted to do was make sure that some of those, either the fruits or even the devices or things that we use in the text, to help children understand how they look like, so that, because of the black and white illustrations. And I remember for the third book, we had a new designer who had come on, because there's a big gap between the second book and the third book, so we've change of gods in Walker. And she asked me, "Oh, do we want to give any image references to Uma?" And I said, "No, she is the guru, so she'll know exactly what to do." So I emailed her and said, "Do you need me to tell you anything?" And she goes, "I know everything," because we both are from very similar backgrounds from a cultural perspective. So she knew exactly what I meant from most of those things. So it was but we don't talk when we illustrate at all. Like, no, I don't see it until it's fully done. So it's between the designer and Uma that they decide what's going to get illustrated and where it's going to fit in.
But what a wonderful relationship then, and the fact that you got to choose your illustrator is probably a rare treat. But that was wonderful, finding out about, we should get her on in another one, talking about where she goes to get those elements of inspiration, and it comes through so clearly. So that's wonderful. Now we've got your nephew to thank for this third book then. So my final question is, will we get any more stories?
Oh, I don't know.
What are you thinking?
I don't know. We'll have to see, because I'm working on another series for Walker, which is a Sona Sharma series. So I've just written the third one, so I have to write one more in that, and then we'll probably think about coming back to this one. But this is really popular in Key Stage 2, and parents and Indian parents. I get lots of emails from US, because this book, the first two went out to the US as well, and a lot of responses, and the audiobook got a lot of awards as well. So I'm hoping.
The thing is about them is, I mean, we're all hoping too, is they're these old stories that you're reimagining, and they're young children kind of solving these stories. I could just keep reading them over and over and over, you know, and they're going, so when's the new one going to happen? Because this idea of two children being able to solve problems that maybe the adults can't solve through their wit and wisdom is a really appealing thing. Now, we've got about 14 or 15 minutes left, and we're hit with a huge first question from the people that have attended by JC. Are we seeing more diverse books available to children? From my point of view as a parent, we are, if we look at diverse publishers, but what more needs to be done? Now, Chitra, you and I care deeply about this, and this is something we've been talking a lot about. So I'm going to turn on my light because I might be in semi-darkness now, but I'm going to let you start answering and I'll join.
Okay. I don't think there is any question or argument that we need more diversity at all. That, like, literally we need, because our children in every classroom is representative of so many cultures, and we do need stories of those. And also I think we need more stories that, because we don't want the single story syndrome, right? We don't want everybody to think this is an Indian story and every story should be like this, or this is exactly what happens. And it's not true. Even when I'm writing an Indian story, I have to research it, because India is such a vast country. What I know of it is not exactly what the research might be. So I think we definitely need more work. It's definitely improving. There are more voices. There are new authors and illustrators coming on board. We do need more people to tell lots of different stories, not just retell folk tales for the sake of curriculum, but we do need people to tell all sorts of stories, contemporary stories and traditional tales, so that everybody is able to. And I think we can learn from each other by reading each other's stories.
And that's lovely. And I think that whole as many different voices as possible telling is a really nice thing. I spoke to a local bookseller, Blackwells, and they're in Oxford. They're trying really hard. They really are trying really hard to diversify what's on display. And I think that's a big thing too. You know, it can't be too difficult to change up what you have on display and give space to the different voices. And you also touched on the research you do on in India. You know, you might say, well, I might know it, but it's so vast, I've got to do the research. And I think there's that whole idea of diversity being done well and being read well, because otherwise it can probably do more damage than it can do good as well. And that's something that interesting balance. But that first question is probably an hour in itself, really.
True.
And there's been a lot of panels on it over the summer, but it's a great one. Tanya, hello Tanya, lovely to hear from you again.
Hi Tanya.
Tanya, you've asked, are there stories, Chitra, from other cultures that you're really drawn to, that you'd be interested in telling?
Yes and no. So I have a whole shelf full of folk tales and traditional tales I read from all cultures. But I know that if I retell a story, I've done enough research for it. So I retold 2 stories from a different culture for Penguin Puffin last year, and it was 1,000-word story, but I probably spent 2.5 months researching it. I went to all the primary research I can get to make sure every detail was right, because that is the responsibility that comes with telling another story. And for me, that's time, but also if there's somebody else who is better placed to tell that story, especially if that story is from somebody who's not as privileged as me, then I'd rather they tell that story and not me. It's a balance, whether I can tell a story or not, and that's me deciding, because I want to make sure that the story is authentic, because I'm a writer of color in the UK, and I know how upset I get when I see a badly written Indian story. So I don't want to write a badly of another culture. So I want to make sure if I'm writing another story, I have the agency to do that. I have the research behind it. I totally understand all the viewpoints of that story before I tell it.
That's lovely. And that word responsibility, that sense of a responsibility in telling a story is really, it's a really powerful image. I think it's possibly a new phrase that we're hearing a lot. One that I've heard a lot on social media is learning to step aside. And I really like that image, actually, and giving space as well. Thank you. That's a really powerful, lots to go away and think about with there. So totally different question now from Tracy, which is about the writing process. And actually, we haven't talked a lot about the writing process. I'm really sorry we didn't get onto that as much as I would like to. But Tracy asked the question, when you're writing or all through the writing process, are there moments where you read your work aloud?
All the time. So even a chapter book, I will read after every edit. So if I've done a big edit, so I take a week to do a whole edit, then I will go back and read the whole thing. So I will do two things. I'll read myself, so I know if I'm tripping over words, or I can hear the same word again and again, which means I'm repeating a word, which I obviously will do before the nth edit. The second thing I do is I make my computer read out to me. So then I keep the draft open and the computer is reading and I'm editing as I'm going, because then I can because chapter books are 10,000 words, they take an hour to read, so I don't want to keep reading for an hour, so I get the computer to read it and I edit it. If for example, I did Shubh Diwali for an American publisher, American rhyming, so I will make the computer read in English accent, American accent, and make sure I get both right. And then I have very good critique partners. Mo O'Hara is on the call, Margaret Bateson Hill. I will give it to them and I'll ask Mo to read the American version in her American accent, and then I'll ask Margaret to read it in the British accent, and I'll just say, can you see that works? So yeah, I have to read it all the time. I remember writing a lullaby book, which I think I have to be quiet about it. Mara is on the line anyway, so it's coming out with Walker soon. And Margaret actually sang it for me. She put it into tune during our critique group meeting. And then we knew, okay, that's not working. I have to go back and change that. But she said which word she had to stretch or feel uncomfortable in the tune. And then we went back and changed it.
That's amazing. I've never heard anyone say things like that before, especially the whole, well, Margaret sounds like a wonder, but that whole audio book in English and American back so you can hear it. I was expecting a totally different answer. So that's so lovely to hear that. Great question, clearly, Tracy. So, Savita, I think I kind of asked you a question about the inspiration, but Beck and Sue have asked a similar question. One's from an 8-year-old, and it's through the 8-year-old, but one's from the person asking it. And it's, can you talk a little bit about the titles of the 3 books that you've got here?
So the titles always come last, as I tell all the children I visit in school. So I write the story and then I kind of pick out the words to create the titles. So it was so lucky in all 3 cases my titles went through. But the American one, when they did the digest edition, the publisher picked the title. But what happens is when I finish the book, I write 10 titles in the end of the book and I pass it to Mara. Mara comes back with her preferences and then we go back and forth and then we'll shortlist and then she'll take it to sales and then they'll come back with what they like. And in all the 3 cases, my first choices, I think, were first choices for the publisher as well. And then when US kind of put the first 2 books together into a digest, then they created the title Mango's Mischief and Tales of Friendship as the cover title. But inside, the book titles are there inside.
Okay, that's really, I think they work really beautiful. They're almost lyrical, but now all I've got is like Margaret's probably singing these titles to you to see how they sound.
Probably not, but yeah, it'll be good to make her do that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, I should have, yes, I've got that one from Sue, which is great. Larissa asks, and it's the designer from Walker Books, and it's a really interesting question, which is, because it goes back to what traditional tales are for, really, but what is there a main message that you want children to take away from your stories after reading them, these ones in particular, and is it something that you're thinking of as you're writing?
First, a big shout out to Larissa. She did the design for this book. Beautiful.
Well
So
done,
thank
Larissa.
you,
Beautiful.
Larissa. And yes, I think that's the beauty of the traditional tales, though. It's free, it's bonus along with the stories, because the cleverness of the solutions give you that right versus wrong, good versus evil automatically, and therefore, well, the underdog wins, or most of those messages are in the traditional tales. So these stories definitely bring out for me, and the kids understand it right away. It's between fairness and unfairness. It's who is privileged, who is not. So that comes out, and the children are definitely able to understand that.
I think it's almost a lovely thing to end on, really. Thinking about Christopher Booker, who wrote the 7 basic plots, and I think Neil Phillips just like, no, there aren't 7 basic plots. But I do like this idea of voyage and return and that rebirth, but also the things you talked about that seems to be inherent in all traditional tales, which is this, wisdom versus ignorance, truth versus justice, or injustice, or lying, and all those elements of fairy tales that you're saying, traditional tales, sorry, that you're saying children inherently tap into. And I think it's because they're the stories that make us who we are. We're constantly trying to find our place in the world, and sometimes we're looking for rules, whether they're societal rules, and what's going to make us better as people, and what are the right choices and the good choices. I think that's what's beautiful about your story, Chitra, is they are about the human spirit, really, and being a part of a culture and a community. And I had more questions about food and things like that, but I can realize we've got 1.5 minutes to go. And the last question I can see by Phil is such a massive question that we might need to type it somewhere, or maybe we can reply in a different way, because it's a big one about censorship, really. And I'd rather close on talking about the power of your stories to show children that they can make good choices in the world for the right reasons. So Chitra, thank you so much for this evening. It's been an absolute delight, and there's been some lovely comments in the chat going through about the things that you've been saying. Thank you everyone else that's attended this evening, and a special thank you to Chitra herself for asking me to come along and talk to her. It's been such a lovely evening. Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much, Chitra.
Thank you for doing this with so much joy, and you did lots of preparation. So thank you. I know you were a bit poorly this week, but thank you, Tamara Bergman, the editor, for this entire series, and Larissa and the rest of the Walker team as well. Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much for coming today.